Welcome to Truth Behind History. If you're new here, this is the place where we break down historical events, political ideologies, and pivotal moments that have shaped the modern world, without the fluff, and with all the nuance. Today, we're diving into a fascinating and controversial topic, third way politics. Now, I know what you might be thinking, third way? What happened to the first two? And that's exactly the question we need to explore. This ideology sits at the crossroads between capitalism and socialism, trying to merge the best of both worlds while avoiding their extremes. But is this balancing act a clever compromise or just political gymnastics? Let's find out. Third way politics is one of those ideological experiments that sounds great on paper. It's a centrist philosophy that attempts to bridge the gap between capitalism and socialism. Think of it as a political Goldilocks zone, not too free market, not too state-controlled, but just right, or so its advocates claim. But how does it work? Instead of rigidly adhering to traditional left-wing ideologies like full government control over the economy, third-way politicians borrow selectively from both sides. They support free markets, but with guardrails. They push for social welfare, but with an emphasis on personal responsibility. They want globalization, but without the economic instability it can bring. Historically, this approach gained traction in the late 20th century as a response to the failures of the two dominant economic systems, socialism, which had struggled with inefficiency and stagnation, and neoliberalism, which was often blamed for rising inequality and financial instability. As globalization picked up speed, political leaders sought a more adaptable and pragmatic solution to economic governance. Thus, the third way was born. So, what does third way politics actually look like in practice? Well, it's built on two core pillars: economic strategies that encourage market growth while maintaining government oversight, and social welfare reforms designed to reduce poverty without creating long-term dependence. First, let's talk about economic strategies. Unlike traditional left-wing policies that advocate for heavy state intervention, third-way governments embrace market-driven growth. They push for private enterprise, technological innovation, and free trade, but with conditions. Governments still play a role in regulating industries, preventing monopolies, and ensuring fair competition. A key aspect of this strategy is fiscal responsibility. Third-way leaders often position themselves as financially disciplined, aiming to reduce national debt and avoid the kind of reckless spending that critics associate with socialist economies. At the same time, they recognize the risks of unregulated capitalism, so rather than a hands-off approach, they opt for the light-touch regulation. On the social welfare side, the focus shifts to targeted programs rather than broad, universal handouts. Welfare-to-work initiatives encourage individuals to move from government assistance into employment. Investments in education and healthcare are framed as ways to create a stronger workforce, rather than just as social safety nets. The idea is to strike a balance, provide enough support to uplift people out of poverty, but not so much that it discourages self-sufficiency. Now, this all sounds reasonable in theory, but how did it actually play out? That brings us to our case studies. To really understand the impact of third-way politics, let's take a look at two of its most famous architects, Tony Blair in the UK and Bill Clinton in the US. First up, Tony Blair's new Labour government. When he took office in 1997, Britain had spent nearly 2 decades under the conservative leadership of Margaret Thatcher and her successor, John Major. The economy had been reshaped by neoliberal policies, privatisation, deregulation, and a shrinking welfare state. Blair saw an opportunity to modernize the Labour Party by embracing market-friendly reforms while expanding public services. His government increased funding for the National Health Service, implemented tax credits for low-income families, and introduced measures to reduce child poverty, all while promoting business growth and foreign investment. Then, across the Atlantic, we have Bill Clinton's version of the third way. Clinton came to power at a time when the US was grappling with a ballooning deficit and growing concerns over the welfare system. His administration pursued welfare reform, signing the 1996 Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act, which limited long-term benefits and required recipients to actively seek employment. He also focused on balancing the federal budget and championed globalization, which led to economic growth, but also to increased income disparity. While these policies boosted corporate profits and stock market gains, critics argue they widened the gap between the rich and poor. So, was the third way a success? Well, it depends on who you ask. Of course, no political philosophy is without its critics, and the third way is no exception. Two major criticisms stand out: income inequality and the erosion of labor rights. Let's start with income inequality. Many argue that third-way policies, despite their centrist branding, ended up prioritizing corporate interests over ordinary workers. By promoting free trade, deregulation, and privatization, these governments contributed to wage stagnation and growing wealth gaps. While the economy as a whole expanded, the benefits were not evenly distributed. The rich got richer, the middle class shrank, and for many lower-income workers, economic security became more precarious than ever. Then there's the issue of labor rights. Since third-way governments embraced business-friendly policies, many labor unions saw their influence decline. Workers had less bargaining power, leading to weaker job security and fewer protections. The argument here is that while the third way promised a balance between economic growth and social responsibility, it often leaned too far in favor of business interests at the expense of working-class protections. Alright, so third-way politics had its moment in the spotlight, but does it still hold up today? Many center-left politicians continue to borrow elements from the third-way playbook. Leaders like Emmanuel Macron in France and Keir Starmer in the UK have adopted its core principles, championing market-based growth while maintaining social protections. However, the third way also faces a unique challenge: political extremes. In recent years, we've seen a resurgence of both progressive left-wing movements that push for stronger state intervention and right-wing populist movements that reject globalization altogether. This has left the third way struggling to stay relevant. Can it still offer a viable alternative, or has it been overshadowed by new ideological battles? So, what's the final verdict on third-way politics? On one hand, it undeniably shaped modern governance, influencing center-left policies across the globe. Its focus on economic liberalization and social welfare helped redefine left-leaning parties, making them more electorally viable in an era of globalization. But on the other hand, critics argue that its compromises have weakened traditional left-wing movements, leaving them unable to challenge rising economic inequality. With today's political landscape shifting dramatically, the third way stands at a crossroads. Does it evolve, or does it fade into history? If you enjoyed this deep dive into political history, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more. Check out our other videos if you're interested in how history still shapes our world today. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.